Hi, I'm Ben Wright, a historian at the University of Texas at Dallas, and I'm excited to tell you about my book, Bonds of Salvation: How Christianity Inspired and Limited American Abolitionism. This is the story of Christianity and the fight against slavery from the American Revolution through the Civil War. And I'd like to start by reading a quote to you, a quote that in many ways began the line of questioning that drove the research of this book. So in 1814, the Methodist missionary Joshua Marsden recalled his encounters with slavery, and he wrote this in his diary. "Never go to the southern states of America. They are polluted with slavery, and slavery is the most demoralizing thing under the sun. It is the parent of oppression, the nurse of sloth and guilty passions. It is the bane of man, the abomination of God. Where slavery reigns, a human being is made a beast of burden or the slave of lust. The poor, half-famished Negro trembles at a tyrant's nod and loses every good quality in the servility of a drudge or the wickedness of a prostitute. Oh, that this scandal of humanity were annihilated." Now, when I read this passage in Marsden's diary, I was excited and convinced that I had found a new influential anti-slavery thinker that historians haven't previously focused on. But the frustrating truth is that Joshua Marsden never penned a petition against slavery. He never wrote to a legislator in favor of abolition. He never joined an anti-slavery organization of any kind. Despite writing this powerful, passionate material, he seemingly did nothing more than write these 7 sentences that are buried deep into a long autobiography all about his missionary work. And Marsden was not alone in this. I continue to encounter these white Christians who would privately condemn the institution of slavery, yet publicly take no major action. So this is what drove this book, trying to figure out how did American Christianity encourage this type of inaction, and what changed to inspire the later, larger, more active Christian abolitionist movement. Well, to understand how Christianity shaped the development of the fight against slavery, we have to take seriously an intellectual worldview that it looked to heaven to change life on earth. From the American Revolution through the first few decades of the 19th century, many Americans optimistically believed that the world was rapidly improving, and that these improvements would advance most speedily and most thoroughly as long as the gospel of salvation continued to spread. Now, a small number of folks that we traditionally associate with the abolitionist movement, of course, Black Christians, we could think of Quakers, a few others, believed instead that in order for the nation to be saved, it must first purify itself of the sin of slavery. But these voices were largely drowned out by others, groups that I call conversionists, folks that believe that looking to heaven will most surely fix the problems on earth. And in fact, Marsden himself rejoiced that the world would soon radically change. In fact, he wrote, "The Redeemer's kingdom is gloriously near." But in order for the change to happen, he believed, and I quote him again, "If the world is to be reformed, God will doubtless employ his son, and his son will employ the gospel." So the gospel was being credited as the most effective agent of emancipation, not anti-slavery organizing. So Marsden's mission of extending salvation, he believed, was, in his words, capable of doing infinite good. But the missionary work that men like Marsden were engaged in required coordination. And after independence from Britain severed the denominational bonds that had previously held together Christian communities, Americans had to create their own new institutions. So this book tracks how from 1785 through 1814, the largest Protestant traditions formed new national networks, new national denominations that were designed to carry the gospel across the American continent and eventually all over the globe. Now, constructing these national institutions required avoiding the divisiveness of slavery. And so white American Christian leaders worked to contain, ignore, and even oppose the ongoing agitation of Black Christians. Instead, the leaders of American denomination, they focused on binding the nation together through the pursuit of expanding salvation, even when that prioritization had the effect of tightening the shackles of slavery. To further facilitate the expansion of salvation, these new denominational institutions established the many reform organizations that historians call the Benevolent Empire. We could think here of missionary societies, the American Bible Society, Tract Society, Sunday School Union, but the one I spend the most time on is the American Colonization Society, formed in 1815, originally from a network of Presbyterians, with the goal of addressing the problem of slavery by relocating Black Americans to West Africa. But even here, we see that salvation structured this movement. As colonizationists maintained their coalition of anti-slavery and post-slavery folks, Northerners and Southerners, they maintained this unity by prioritizing the mission of bringing salvation to Africa and moral redemption to the United States. But while many Black Americans also dreamed of seeing Christian salvation expand in Africa, few were willing to relocate themselves and their families across an ocean to a continent where they had never been before. So many Black Americans resisted colonization, and by the 1830s, new attacks against the movement of colonization emerged from both pro-slavery zealots and abolitionists as well. But again, we see visions of missionary work and salvation structuring this debate. These new Christian abolitionists increasingly came to see slavery as an all-corrupting plague that mocked American pretensions of Christian righteousness. Those that opposed abolitionists did so by appealing to the higher priority of expanding salvation and pointing out quite rightly that slavery and Christian salvation were in fact quite compatible. In fact, this book talks about how the Methodist mission to the slaves is, I believe, the most effective agent of Christianization in the history of the United States. But abolitionists wouldn't have it. They increasingly believed that slavery and salvation were incommensurate, and that anyone who opposed the agenda of abolition could not actually serve as a real barrier of the true Christian gospel. So these increasingly rancorous conflicts over slavery and salvation eventually tore apart the three largest Protestant denominations. Presbyterians splintered in 1837, the Methodists in 1844, and Baptists in 1845. Once they were unmoored from one another, Northern and Southern Christians only accelerated the tensions, the sectional tensions that marched the nation towards secession, war, and eventually emancipation. Now, in each phase of this process, Americans remained deeply concerned about salvation of their families, their neighbors, their nation. Indeed, the bonds of salvation tied the nation together and structured both the opportunities and the limitations of the fight against slavery. Moreover, the bonds of salvation really created and nearly destroyed the American nation. So for students and scholars of American history, this study offers a few new insights. One, it uncovers and demonstrates the power of the ideologies that structured the world of the early republic. It offers new categories to think through the relationship between belief and action. And it shows how Christianity shaped the ways that Americans understood their world and the ways to make it better. Now, second, this book also encourages us to recognize that American Christianity had to be built. And tracking the way in which the actual institutions and networks of American Christianity were built shows that national denominations were among the most powerful forces in the creation of nationalisms that both made and nearly unmade the American nation. Now, for everybody, scholars, students, or the general interested public, this story reminds us of the deep and complicated history of American Christianity and its fight over white supremacy, a history that continues to shape our world today. I hope you read the book, and if you do read the book, please don't be a stranger. I would love to hear from you. Thanks.